So kind of a heavy passage, and I think the easiest way to tackle it is we're really seeing two contrasting figures. We're seeing Adam and we're seeing Jesus. And so as they're kind of intertwined, we'll track through Adam first and see what Paul is saying here about Adam. And so Adam, he says, when Adam sinned, sin entered the world. Adam's sin brought death, so death spread to everyone, for everyone sinned. And so he's saying that sin wasn't a problem for the human race. It was possible to sin. Adam and Eve did it. But it wasn't inevitable. And so the relationship of the world to sin was, it's something that can happen, but has not happened. And when it did happen, we're told that the effects of that is that sin brought death, so death spread to everyone because everyone sinned. The sin spreads and the death spreads. And so there's this understanding that we get that human beings were created in God's image. They were made to live forever and worship Him, but things changed when Adam sinned, and the whole situation of the world is different. And so Paul goes on to say, yes, people sinned even before the law was given, before they knew the rules, before there was the 10 Commandments, before there was 613 statutes of the Old Testament law that told us right from wrong. Before that, people sinned, but he says, yes, people sinned even before the law was given, but it was not counted as sin because there was not yet any law to break. They didn't know what they were supposed to do. Still, everyone died from the time of Adam to the time of Moses. That's the time that the law was given. And so he says everybody died anyway. The effects of sin made it so that everyone would die. Our bodies break down. Some of us are getting older, and we're not like at that, age where we're like 22 and under, where nothing bad can happen, and there's no such thing as danger, and we can take on any challenge. And some of us, I'm looking for nods from the guys like me that challenge the laws of gravity and common sense and safety. And there were lots of things I did that were dangerous. I never owned a motorcycle, and I never owned a motorcycle because I put my mom through enough. And by the time I was of an age I could afford a motorcycle, I'd kind of come to my senses and went, that would be really cool, but my mom's had enough. And I didn't buy one for her. It's probably good. I'm a klutz. It probably wouldn't have gone well. So, did I save her heartache or did she save me skin? I don't know. And so Paul says, yes, people sinned even before the law was given, but still everyone died from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even those who did not disobey an explicit command of God as Adam did. Adam knew he was not supposed to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He knew what that rule was, and he broke it willingly. But after that, we're told that people did stuff, and there was no one telling them what was right and wrong. There are some things that we know are self-evident in the world, that cultures everywhere that have never heard of Jesus know that certain things are just wrong, and they feel the guilt of them. But even those other things, there isn't this sense that people knew what they were supposed to do and what they weren't supposed to do. And if you walk out into the world today and you talk to a whole bunch of different people, if you talk to them for very long at all and ask them what's right, what's wrong, you get a different list from almost everybody. Very few people have the same list of right and wrong. They might all agree, yep, killing people is wrong. I hope you don't run into anybody that goes, no, I think that's okay. But they all have some things in common, but everybody's got different ideas about different stuff. And so Paul says, look, this consequence of death, it's not just because you broke a rule that you should have known better. It's that Adam's sin did something to the world so that death came. And death didn't come as a direct result. It's not like, oh, I went and did sin and immediately I died. That didn't even work that way for Adam and Eve. But what did happen is their bodies were made before that not to break down. And as soon as they ate of the fruit, as soon as they did what they weren't supposed to do, death entered the world, so that whether they died slow or quickly, they were gonna die. And so our bodies break down, and some of us feel it, Others of us are just watching the old people in the room and going, yep, I'm not even aware of that yet, but look around you. There's somebody that you can tell. There are signs. They did not always look like this, right? They didn't always look this decrepit. I wasn't born with these gray hairs. My muscle tone, I used to have some. But death is this physical consequence of sin in the world. And it's not about, it wasn't about people making a choice they knew violated God's will, and then all of a sudden they die. But sin itself being in the world causes death to start. And everyone is caught in that. We all sin and we all die, but it's not that we die as a direct result as soon as we sin, or because we sin, then, that's starting and it's accumulating and it's going to build up to death. It's not that sin is punished with death. Sin brings death. So sin is like cancer. It's going to kill its host eventually, right? That's the prognosis. If it's serious cancer, if you've got a life-threatening disease, the disease will eat away at you and it will kill you, but it's not a punishment for getting cancer. Nobody gets cancer because it's their own fault for getting it, and therefore they're going to die and you had it coming, right? We don't look at it that way. And so sin brings death, not as a punishment, but as a consequence of sin being in the world. And so Adam's sin brings death. But then Paul also mentions that Adam's sin brings condemnation. He says it's not just physical death, there's this spiritual consequence, this distance between us and God, this relational distance. And so he says, yes, Adam's sin brings condemnation for everyone, but Christ's one act of righteousness brings a right relationship with God. He says, Adam's sin brings condemnation for everyone because one person disobeyed God, many became sinners. So he says there's this relational dimension, and Jesus is different, but for Adam and those of us who are born of Adam's race, everybody who's human, we're brought not just death, but maybe even worse than that, this condemnation that we're separated relationally from God. And so this right relationship with God is severed for Adam. And this relationship that he and Eve had in the garden where they walked with God in the cool of the day. Like they were that close to him. And now there's distance because of what they've done. And he says it spreads from one person, Adam, to many. And so the sin spreads and the death spreads. And the effects of it, everyone feels. They feel the relational distance with God, and they feel this death, this physical death that comes from that as well. And so Adam has those two consequences, not only on him and Eve and his offspring, but all of the human beings who will ever be born. Well, let's back up a little and look at Jesus and follow that thread that Paul highlights. He says, now Adam is a symbol, a representation of Christ who was yet to come. But there's a great difference between Adam's sin and God's gracious gift. Paul's paralleling here Adam and Jesus, but he says the big difference is there's a great difference between Adam's sin and God's gracious gift. Adam's sin is inevitable. It affects us whether we like it or not. We didn't actually choose it all the time, but we do choose to sin as a result of sin entering the world. And so everybody does it. But he says, now Adam is a symbol and a representation of Christ who is yet to come. Now here's where we need to understand something about Adam. Adam's name, Adam, in the Hebrew, means man. Also means mankind. So wherever in Scripture we see man meaning, people, right? Men and women, And so in the story of creation, God said, let us make man in our image, male and female, he created them. And so there's male and female in man, in mankind, and God makes them both in his image. And so Paul says Adam is a symbol, a representation of Christ who is yet to come. He's paralleling them and saying, Adam and Jesus, there's this parallel. There's this togetherness of them in terms of Adam being a symbol or a representation of Christ. Adam is this first human being, and his proper name is Adam, but Adam, is also man or mankind. And if you understand that, if Adam means man, like any individual man, and it means mankind, and it means, that dude named Adam, then that plays into how we understand this passage. So when it says in our passage, for the sin of this one man, this one Adam, it's like the sin of this one Adam, right? This one man who happens to be named man or Adam brought death to many, but even greater is God's wonderful grace and his gift of forgiveness to many through this other Adam, Jesus Christ. So he's saying there's two men that are parallel, and one brings this negative effect on everybody. He affects the people who will follow him in the human race. And in case we start to go, well, that doesn't seem fair, that his sin affects us, look around at the world we live in. Because when people are unkind, when people do things that don't honor God, when they walk around selfishly looking after themselves, they don't just hurt themselves, right? They hurt everybody else by the way that they live. And so we feel the shrapnel of sin all the time. We feel the effects of other people's sin just like we feel the effects of our own. And sometimes we find we're the victim, and sometimes we find we're the perpetrator. And both happen. We can't walk around in the world very long without believing in sin. If you just walk around thinking everybody's a good person, and nobody's really a bad person at all, then you're going to have to stop watching the news. You're going to have to stop paying attention to some of the people in your neighborhood, baby. You're going to have to ignore a whole bunch of stuff. We know that we're affected by other people's sins, some people's more than others. The people we're close to and the things they do or say that might be cruel, those things really hurt. So Paul says, for the sin of one man, one Adam, brought death to many, but even greater is God's wonderful grace and his gift of forgiveness to many through this other man, Adam, Jesus Christ. He's going, one man wrecked it for everybody, but one man came and fix things for everybody. And so he says that this gift of forgiveness comes to many, not to everyone, but it's available to everyone through this other man, Jesus Christ. And the result of God's gracious gift is very different from the result of that one man's sin. Adam's sin brings death and condemnation, but what Jesus brings is the opposite. And that's why Paul had said, Adam is a symbol or a representation of Christ who is yet to come, but there's a great difference between Adam's sin and God's gracious gift. He says, but Christ's one act of righteousness brings a right relationship with God and new life to everyone. Jesus undoes what Adam does. Adam brings death, and Jesus brings life. Adam brings separation from God, and Jesus brings reconciliation with God so that we can get close to him again. So that we can find our true purpose and our true identity. And so as we've talked about looking into Scripture to find our true identity and understand what it means to be made in God's image and to live in alignment with that, we need to understand that what Adam did made that impossible. But then what Jesus did made it possible again. And so what Adam did made it inevitable that we could not sin. But what Jesus did made it possible for us to stop doing the things that harm us and harm everyone around us. And so we have a real choice to follow God and to hear his voice. And when we dig into Scripture, we're not left with well, I'll never live up to that. I'll never be able to obey that. I could never do it that way. And so Adam is this symbol. He's this representation of Christ. He's the first Adam, but then Jesus is the second Adam. He's the one who we are all descended from, but we also have Jesus, and we are descended from him if we give our hearts to him. And so Paul says, for the sin of this one man, Adam, brought death to many, but even greater is God's wonderful gift of forgiveness to many through this other man, Jesus Christ. And the result of this gracious gift is very different from the result of that one man's sin. For Adam's sin led to condemnation, but God's free gift leads to our being made right with God, even though we're guilty of many sins. And so there's this sin nature that's in us that makes it hard and impossible for us to follow God and do the right thing. But then there's these sins, with the small s, the kind of sin that comes from that nature, that part of us that's stuck in that endless loop of doing the wrong thing and following the wrong path and living in the wrong way. And so Jesus reverses things so that we are back where Adam and Eve were in the garden, where we can be close to God and we can make the right choice. And we aren't forced to make the right choice, but it's possible now to do it. And so Paul says, look, this is what Jesus did. He reverses the curse. He heals us of the disease, and now it's up to us to live in alignment with that. And so Jesus brings this new way to be human, but it's not totally new. It's like the original factory settings, right? It's the way that we were designed to be in the beginning. And so Jesus brings this new way to be human. For God knew his people in advance, and he chose them to become like his son. Some translations have that word predestined. For God knew his people in advance, and he predestined them to become like his son, so that his son would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And there's a lot of confusion about that. But the idea of he designed them, for he knew his people in advance, and he chose for them to be like his son. That's what he wanted, and that's what he wants. So that his son would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. He welcomes us into his family, and he makes us like him. And he changes our hearts and our destiny. And so Paul says, God knew his people in advance, and he chose them, what he wants for them, his design for them, his plan for them, for us, for you and me, is that we would become like Jesus. So that likeness of him starts to shine out. It's in there, and it's who we were meant to be, but to live in alignment with that and to follow that as our true identity is what Paul's talking about. So as I said in Romans 8:28, he says, for God knew his people in advance, and he predestined them to become like his son, so that his son would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And having chosen them, he called them to come to him. And having called them, he gave them right standing with himself. And having given them right standing, he gave them his glory. Our God is a glorious God. We sing about it all the time. But he says that we can have in on that glory. But our path to that is that he calls us. He doesn't force us. He doesn't make us do it. It isn't inevitable. But his desire, his plan, his way of doing things, he wants us. And so he calls us. And then he gives us right standing with him so that we can be right in our hearts and know that we're doing the right thing. And when he gives us right standing with himself, then he, having given them right standing, he gives them his glory. And so this morning, as we gather as his people, and we consider what our place is in the world, and we think about what is my purpose, and how should I live, and what would give me satisfaction, and how can I be truly happy and fulfilled? Paul says this is what it is. It's to take that image of God and to realize that the path to living in union with that is to live according to the scriptures. But he says we couldn't have done that. We can't do that outside of what Jesus has done for us and what we allow Jesus to do in us. And so it's important for us to look at the scriptures and understand what it means to live in alignment with it, but knowing that we can't do it ourselves. That it's impossible for us to live up to it. And when we feel that way, we're right, except for Jesus. And so Jesus does in us and for us what we can't do for ourselves, to remake us the way that he intended human beings to be, to treat each other well, to look after the world around us, to care for creation, and to do those things that live in alignment with his purposes so that we have a positive impact on the people around us instead of hurting each other. Instead of living painfully for ourselves and for everyone else. He's healing the world through Jesus and through his work, but his work is done through us. And so as we looked at Acts, we saw that beautiful picture of the early church. And now as we understand that, we understand this isn't a beautiful story of what happened back then, but it is the living reality of what God has planned for you and I today. To live in alignment with that and to have the kind of impact that the early church had, because we love our lives and because we know who we were born to be. And we're living to be that to the best of our ability. And that may seem daunting, it may seem impossible, and it kind of is for us, but not for Jesus. And what Paul assures us in this passage, the beautiful thing about this passage, the good news that Jesus has shared with the world, that Paul shares with the people in Rome, is that it is possible through Jesus. He wants to do what we could not. His plan for you is not just to let you off the hook. It's not to just not punish you. His plan is to give you a beautiful life to live in the world that will heal the wounds of people around you and will help you heal your own wounds, that will help you to live selflessly when the whole world seems to want to live selfishly. And Paul says that's completely doable. Not because you have any strength or power, or because you have so much willpower, or because you are such a good person deep down, but because the image of God is stamped on you and because Jesus is willing to work with you to polish that to the surface so that you will see and know who you are. You will live like a child of God. Because Paul says we are his brothers and sisters. We are his. And as he welcomes us into the family, his influence changes us. The only question is whether we want to do that or not, whether we are willing to allow him or not, because it's not automatic. So he says his will for us is this, and then it's up to us to decide whether we want it or not. But every time you choose it, the Spirit of God works in you to give you life where there was deadness, to pull you into the real life that is there for you, that is living in the life and the glory of God.